Thanks, Travis, for starting up another Bible study. Tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Pastor Elizabeth. It's my pleasure. We were talking about some of the other courses we had done, and then last time we did the letters of Paul, and what seemed to interest some was that I would always give kind of the historical comparison as to what was going on while Paul is writing this. That's kind of the way I approach most all of my classes, I like to talk about what else is going on in the world. So that's why we even call this class the Hebrew Bible in its historical setting. So for the first class, I want to go way back and kind of get a running start, as it were, into the time of the patriarchs, as they're called. That is usually to say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the 12 tribes after that. What we'll do is we'll get up to the period of the monarchy and the unified kingdom, that is to say Saul and David and Solomon. But sometimes we lose context about how much had already been going on, that actually Israel winds up being a rather late player in the game. There was a lot that had gone on before. Humanity had been around for a long time. Of course, a lot of times Augustine wanted to take all the ages of the Old Testament patriarchs and put them together and say, the earth was created 6,000 years BC, or 6,000 years ago. That, of course, just doesn't really hold up. But even Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, said, that's not a bad number, because we're not talking about the beginnings of the earth, and we're not even talking about the beginnings of the human race, but we are talking about the beginnings of civilization showing up around 6,000 to 4,000 BC. So he actually gave Augustine a nod and a wink in that. So where we're going to start is not at the beginning, but certainly not at the end where we are. Of course, we know that the Stone Age has been divided into three periods. Stone Age is usually referred to as the Paleolithic period. The old Stone Age was when the beginnings of making tools, crude tools like hammers, and using the chips of flint to start cutting hides and things like that. Did you know that it was 170,000 years ago when humans were beginning to wear clothing? It was about 120,000 years ago when what we now call the Sahara Desert was actually, we referred to it in retrospect as the Abbasia Pluvial. And the Sahara Desert was actually wet. It was a fertile region. In fact, there were marshes there. And as years went on, then it became more like grasslands. And eventually, all the water went underground. What we now know is that underneath the Sahara Desert is this huge primordial reservoir of water. It's not being renewed. It's not being refreshed or replenished. And so some people have talked about, in a water crisis, to go after that water. Well, once that water's gone, it's gone. There's no replacing it. Well, the Sahara, going from fertile savannas and marshes to an arid desert, when did that happen? Well, it was about 90,000 years ago when apparently the earth tilted just a bit on its axis. It caused a shift in the wind currents, and all of a sudden those places along the latitudes of the Sahara all start becoming deserts. And so the Sahara, once lush, is now arid. Now 100,000 years ago, and here we'll look at map number 1, 100,000 years ago, we have the earliest structure in the world, the earliest structures in the world built. They were built there at Wadi Haifa. If you'll see, they're right in the middle of the map. It's on the Nile, and it's right near what's called the second cataract of the Nile River Valley. There were sandstone blocks that were set in kind of a semicircular formation, kind of an oval with an oval foundation. And these were built in Egypt. And these are the oldest structures that we find. Now, we don't find the buildings by any means, but what we do find is that this is the oldest foundation and the oldest, at least a couple of bricks set on top of each other, but it's obvious that it had once been some kind of a building 100,000 years ago. Did it have a roof on it? Probably not. Engineering wasn't quite there yet, but it was certainly at least a place that was beginning to show some probably ceremonial use. On to map 2, 82,000 years ago. We see these small perforated seashell beads from Tafaralt in, you see it circled there on your map, Tafaralt in what is today Morocco. This was the earliest evidence that we have of people adorning themselves, using these seashells in order to create beads and make necklaces and bracelets. 82,000 years ago. 75,000 years ago, the population was beginning to boom. Now, not by any means the 7 billion plus that we have now, but there were a lot of people that were all of a sudden developing on the planet. But 75,000 years ago, the Toba volcano, which is near Sumatra in Southeast Asia, it was a super eruption, the kind of thing that they worry about now with like the Yosemite site, that there's the possibility of a super eruption going on there. This thing is believed to have lowered the human population from maybe several 100,000 down to 15,000. So those who had migrated to certain places, had migrated to other places, were now suffering because of this, what we today call a nuclear winter. 75,000 years ago. 50,000 years ago, and here we'll go to map 3, is we find the earliest sewing needle that was found among the Denisovans in Asia. The Denisovans were a group, and you'll see that green section in there. That's where the Denisovans were. This culture that had developed, we find that 50,000 years ago, the Denisovans were already using needles. In the blue section, you see we found fish hooks there in the river, in a river valley, actually the Ruhr River Valley in Germany. Fish hooks and sewing needles, 50,000 years ago. From there, we move on to the, and you could take the map away from that one. From there, we move to it's called the Upper Paleolithic period, or some people call it the New Stone Age. And tools were becoming pretty sophisticated by then. Not only tools, but instruments. 42,000 years ago, they found evidences of flutes in Germany. Flutes, I mean, kind of like the penny whistle that you would see people playing now. It's also the earliest evidence of advanced deep sea fishing technology that we found at the Jeremalai cave site in East Timor, which is in like Indonesia, around Indonesia. And it showed that they had a really high level of maritime skills, and therefore some sort of technology to go with it to make crossings into the ocean. They were able to reach Australia and other islands, and they were catching and consuming large numbers of fish like tuna. It takes a lot to land a tuna, and these folks 42,000 years ago were having their tuna fish sandwiches. 33,000 years ago is the oldest known evidence that we have of dogs being domesticated. They were both in Europe and in Siberia at that time. So first we have dogs. 33,000 years ago, 29,000 years ago, the first ovens were discovered. And yet, there's ovens, but it's not used for like baking bread. They're starting to do other things with these ovens. They're starting to do like some, serious tanning with that. Only 1,000 years later, after ovens, comes twisted rope. That rope was actually being used, being twined with all the various vines that they could find, and hemp, of course, which was plentiful at the time. And then, now having ovens, you know what comes next? Pottery. They were able to make figurines. They've actually found representations of people, and sometimes they think representations of maybe nature deities. But it's and yet they haven't yet gotten to making like storage vessels, like pots with lids and stuff like that. That will come later. 24,000 years ago. About 18,000 years ago, up to maybe 12,000 years ago, a 6,000 year span, it's believed that a language known as Afro-Asiatic, that's what we call it now, they didn't call it that then, it was spoken as a single language in Africa and in Arabia and what we call the Levant now, which would include like Israel and Syria and Lebanon, all of that called the Levant. That will be the birthplace of languages like, languages like Egyptian and Coptic, and then it'll develop into the Semitic languages of Hebrew and Arabic, and also the languages of the Berbers, which would be in Morocco, and would actually go over into kind of prehistoric Spain. So this was the first language group that we see. And of course, it winds up being the language used to make the very oldest texts that we have. That's a 6,000 year period when that develops. What's hard to believe is that it's not that much longer before then. Well, okay, I say not that much longer, but probably about 100,000 years BC was the first time that we could even speak, that we hadn't developed the language, the larynx, the tongue muscles, and all that. Aside from just grunts and pointing and shouting and screaming, there wasn't really a spoken language for a long, long time because we simply hadn't developed the capability to do that. So now we have the first language, this Afro-Asiatic language that linguists refer to it. It will give birth to Hebrew, Arabic, all of those that will follow after. If you'll show map 4, 15,000 BC is when we see the first human migrations into North America. Now, we all know the story about crossing the Bering Strait far up in the north, because at one point the water levels were so low during certain glacial periods that there was a bridge actually that connected Siberia with Alaska up there. It was called the Bering Sea Bridge. Eventually that receded, but there was enough time that they could actually cross over that by land. But those weren't the first, those weren't the only ones to cross that way. They were actually making sea travel. We talked a minute ago about the fishing that was going on, and they were actually doing some deep sea fishing. Well, they also traveled across the Pacific. So, when we talk about Columbus, or even Leif Erikson, or even that Irish monk who supposedly beat everybody, yeah, they weren't the first to make any such crossing. They crossed the Atlantic, and that's great. These guys crossed the Pacific, and we're talking about a long time before any of the European explorers came across. Historians will say no later than 15,000 BC. Some say maybe as early as 25,000 BC. That's all we need for that one. With about 12,000 BC, the pig gets domesticated. People start raising them in pens, start keeping them in the barnyard, farmyard. And then it's in 11,000 BC that a place called Tel Ramad is built on the outskirts of what is today Damascus. It was settled there as a permanent community. Now, beforehand, people are on the move. They're following the migration of herds. They're following the ripening of nuts, berries, fruit, when they can find them. So people were always on the move following a source. But around 11,000 BC, you have the beginnings of what we call true agriculture. That is to say, they have learned to plant certain seeds and they will eventually grow, and people don't need to travel and follow their food. They can start creating their food right now. 11,000 BC, creating it right here. And Damascus then becomes the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Only 1,000 years later, there's evidence of the first settlement at Jericho. Jericho is an Paleolithic city, an Iron Age city that actually had been through several different layers of building. The one that Joshua and the Israelites got to was probably something like Jericho number 5, because it had been wrecked. One seems to have been wrecked by an earthquake, another by other natural disasters. Sometimes drought would drive the people away from a city. Sometimes war would do that, but wars usually come a good bit later. But Jericho went through several different layers, kind of like what Heinrich Schliemann found out when he discovered the city of Troy, that the city of Troy, he found there were 10 different layers to it. And where the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Trojan War, that was probably Troy number 4. So Troy had been around for a good long time. 1,000 years after that, we've got dogs, we've got pigs, finally have sheep. It's all the smaller animals that you see. Then we come to, with 9,000 BC, we come to what's called the Holocene epoch. And that is basically what geologists and anthropologists refer to as the modern era. We are still in the Holocene epoch. And if we look at map number 5, we find the earliest date that's recorded for the construction of it's called a temenoi, a ceremonial structure. And you see the red star that at the bottom there, Göbekli Tepe. That is the location. It's of course right on the, right close to the river there, and all early civilizations and buildings take place somewhere close to a river. A lot of times because they're bringing stuff down the river, they're transporting wood, stone, other materials like that. So somewhere close to a river is a pretty good idea. For example, the pyramids built along the Nile. So it is and we discover, and if we'll look at number 6, then you'll look at this structure, and it was uncovered, and isn't that fascinating? It's believed to be basically a temple. So this is the very first thing that is recognizably as some kind of a religious structure there. Yeah, I don't know, that picture always kind of gets me. And it was really only discovered in the last century. It is something really quite remarkable. Well, in 8,500, finally, we get around to domesticating cattle. Only 500 years after that, it's estimated, goats, that's the next one. Goats are the next ones to be domesticated. So you see even how slowly that winds up developing as what gets domesticated. There's one creature that you've noticed yet hasn't been domesticated, and it won't be for a little while. It'll be about 1,000 years after that that we'll have the domestication of the cat. That should not surprise anybody who has ever spent any time near a cat. Now, around 7,000 BC, anywhere between 8,000 and 7,000 BC, if we'll look at map number 7, in northern Mesopotamia, which is now northern Iraq, it's the beginning of the cultivation of, sorry, should be the next one, Pastor. There we go. Yeah, you see there, it's called the Fertile Crescent. And if you'll look far up on that map, between especially, well, about where you see the word Assyria, Assyria wasn't there yet, but where that word is, that's where we start seeing the agriculture of barley and wheat. So, barley and wheat. What do you suppose would be the first thing that was made by barley and wheat? It ain't bread. It ain't cereal. It's not gruel. It's not soup. It's beer. Beer is the first thing discovered, and they've actually found preserved in certain jars beer that's not in its liquid form by any means, but what has been kind of a beer reduction, I guess they would call it. They find the sludge that was beer, and beer became an absolute, as people in Wisconsin certainly understand, a beer became a vital instrument in socialization, but also in trade. In fact, Egypt became a great, because they wound up eventually growing so much wheat that they were the ones who created the beer, and that's what the Romans wanted so much. Sure, they wanted the wheat to make bread, but they wanted the beer. And in fact, there was a trade agreement between Israel and Egypt. Egypt loved the cedar trees that could be gotten from what today is Lebanon, and Israel apparently wanted the beer. Sadly, no stories made it into the Bible, probably because, you know, they were too out of it to write the story down. Anyway, so it won't be for a long time that bread will eventually be made. Around that same time, there is an urban settlement in Anatolia, which is in present-day Turkey, and that's where you first see a lot of cats, going back to the cats, being domesticated and kept in the homes there. Now, I don't mean to be this way, but they also found a pit where there were lots and lots of cat skeletons that had apparently been killed by their owners and thrown into the pit. I don't know if it was ceremonial. I don't know if it was just people who didn't realize what they were getting into when they decided to try to have cats in the house. But the cat casualty rate was pretty high there in a place called Catalhuk. Anyway, so now about that same time, the city of Byblos, which is one of the Phoenician cities. In the Bible, we'll read a lot about the cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Those three cities. Those are known as the Phoenician cities. And it's from there that King Ahab will get his wife Jezebel. And so this is an ancient city, and they took a lot of pride in being so ancient. 7,000 BC is when that was apparently settled. So what's going on? We've been talking about the Middle East. We've been talking about Africa. If we look at map number 8, we'll see the earliest development of the Jiahu culture in China. And there in China, you'll see it's actually between the Yellow River, the Huanghe as they called it, and the Yangtze River. And Yeah, sorry, that I couldn't find one that had the rivers marked really well on there. But anyway, if you look on that map of the globe, you can see where China is, and then the large picture of China shows where that was originally located. That seems to be the first real cultural collective there in China. About the same time, and this will surprise, well, it may not surprise you, but around the same time, we have the beginnings in Scandinavia of discovering how to preserve cod. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's the beginnings of lutefisk. 7,000 BC, the first evidence of lutefisk is actually discovered. I figured you'd like that one. But not too long after this, remember in 7,000, Jiahu is the culture began there. Well, within 1,000 years, and you know what? It's relatively short period of time. We think about 1,000 years ago, and Leif Erikson was first landing foot in, Newfoundland. It was a long time ago. 1,000 years ago, there were crusades getting ready to start. But between the settlement there in Jiahu and 6,000 years after, we have the beginnings of writing in China. Now, almost all the early languages begin with kind of pictogram writings. And so in the Chinese kanji, it's called, it's all pictures. And so those pictures represent words. Not to be offensive to anybody, but you should know that the Chinese symbol for trouble is a picture of two women under the same roof. Just thought that was pretty interesting. Also, and this is something that is very fascinating to me, is the Chinese kanji for flood is a boat with 8 people in it. 8. You think of Noah, his 3 sons, and their spouses, you have 8. Is there a connection? Maybe, don't know, certainly interesting. In 5500 is the first smelting of copper that takes place anywhere, 5500. And then if we look at map number 9, by 4000 BC, you have the beginnings of these civilizations that are developing in the Fertile Crescent there. Well, you see that darkened area, and down in the far, near the Persian Gulf, you'll see the cities of Eridu, Ur, and Uruk. Those are the 3 principal city-states of what we'll call the civilization of Sumer. Sumer was a fascinating place. That's where we get some of our earliest literature. That's where we get some of our earliest really monstrous structures. And down there is also, you'll see the beginnings of the domestication of the chicken and the invention of the potter's wheel. Beforehand, it was all just shaping it with your hand. Finally, somebody, after a couple of thousand years, decided, hey, a pot would do pretty good. If we could look at the next one, Pastor. Yeah, you'll see this is where civilizations have developed by this time. Over in China, the Jiahu was in the Huanghe Valley. That's called the Yellow River, by the way. The Yellow River Valley. And in India, the Harappan civilization begins along the Indus River Valley. Mesopotamia, which is going to give us Sumer and so many others, is going to follow along the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And of course, Egypt is going to be along the Nile River Valley. Always somewhere near water is where civilizations are going to develop, because obviously people need water. If they're going to find out they're going to need water for irrigation, but they certainly need it for drink, for cooking, for all of that stuff. Which takes us to the Bronze Age. And with the development of the civilizations, especially in the green area there, Mesopotamia. It comes to be known as the Uruk period, with the Sumerian city-states. It wasn't so much a nation as it was a confederation of these city-states that developed into an alliance. And this is where we begin to see the writings of what we call cuneiform. Cuneiform is not an alphabetic kind of language. It is more like shapes that are taken into, used with reeds, and they would make these impressions in wet clay and then let it sit out or bake it sometimes. So you have these, and I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. You'll have these stone tablets beginning to develop used by these, and when you see that, you'll see obviously that these reeds were be stuck into it and then pressed in a little bit, but in different configurations to make basically different sound symbols. During this period, they start with a mathematical system, but we use base 10 mathematics, and they used what was called base 60 mathematics. In base 10, you count 1 to 10, and then you roll over and start then with 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and then you roll over after 10, 2, 1, 2, 3. See how that works? For them, it was, I don't know why 60 was good, but that was where they started. They kind of abandoned that before too long because they found out, why is base 10 easier? Because you can count. You don't need a calculator with you. You don't need any kind of other instrument. You can just count with your fingers, and if you want to get fancy, with your toes. But they also start developing astronomy. That is to say, they're looking at the stars and the movement of the planets, and they're recognizing that some stars are moving more than the others, the planets, obviously. But with that, there are some who will take that in a different direction and not make it as a science and make it as something more, who knows what. Of course, that's astrology. It's the beginning of civil law. And they begin kind of complex waterworks already by this time. They have a sailboat already. The wheel is being used, and so now we're heading headlong into the Bronze Age. By 4000, yes, ma'am.
Oh, you're just going there. Good. You're giving us a year, because I was like, I'm loving all this. Like, just give me a year for where we're at.
Oh, that we were talking about was basically between 4100 and 3100. I was kind of giving you 1,000 years in a nutshell there. But thanks for that, because I get to take a drink. So we'll look at map 10. In 4000 BC, we see the beginnings of the domestication of the horse. And where does it come from? Well, the greatest population of horses seem to be in this brown area in what today we call Kazakhstan. It's referred to as the steppes, the Russian steppes, which is the far distant grasslands, perfect place for horses to run. But for the Asians, and especially these people along here, horses will become highly prized, not only in trade and transportation, but certainly in war. And it will be the use of the horse that will turn the tide against so many other civilizations once these guys have learned how to do it. A group, they're called the Scythians. That's what the Romans called them. For the Egyptian, they were called the Hyksos. And we'll talk about them in a few minutes. But so here, this is where the horses are really being domesticated, because there's all that that they can run with them, roam with them, and travel these great open spaces between them. So in around the same time, it's the beginnings of what's called the Nakata culture in Egypt. And somewhere around 3500 BC, the first hieroglyphics appear. And you remember what hieroglyphics looks like. They're definitely pictures. But it's not pictures that represent words. They're pictures that represent sounds. And that's kind of an odd thing about the development of that Egyptian language, is because most other pictographic languages will refer to a single word. Not with the Egyptians. It'll be sounds. So instead of letters, they have these pictures to create the sounds to make, obviously, the words. Like I said, that's found somewhere around 3,500. And they were found on tablets in a ruler's tomb in Abydos, Egypt. Around this time also, in Persia, we began to see the beginnings of Susa, the city of Susa, which will be one of the great Persian capitals. And they began the mass production of, and I don't mean mass production like in the Henry Ford style, I just mean there's a lot of people who are doing it. A lot of the reason is because in Susa, there was a really good clay that was used, or that they had available, which made great pottery. So a lot of cottage industry of pottery production developed around that time, and that makes, they're not Persia yet, but at least the region where Susa will be named is starting to trade with other places now. And that's great because everybody wants these high quality food storage vessels with lids on them and all like that to trade everywhere. So the beginnings of technology focused around food is really what draws nations together. There's no conquerors yet, but eventually there will be a conqueror, a guy named Sargon, who is going to decide, why should we make this stuff when we can just go beat up these people and take it from them? The first bully in world history. Around 3600, in the island of Crete in the Mediterranean, it's the beginnings of what's called Minoan culture. And the Minoans will thrive there for quite some time. And but eventually, as I'll mention in a minute or two, they'll be kind of chased out by an earthquake. Around this time also, 3600, is the first evidence of mummies in Egypt. Or I should say mummification, where they have these doctors and scientists were brilliant. I mean, they figured out that what causes such rapid deterioration of a body is the brain being there. So the first thing they do is they remove the brain. That will keep the skull pretty intact, and they also begin treating the body with this stuff called natron, and it will quickly dehydrate the body so that the body doesn't decay. They wrap it up, kind of, I'm not saying airtight, but pretty good. They wrap it up in the linens, put it in a coffin, and then put the coffin in what's called a sarcophagus. So there's kind of this double layer there to keep these bodies intact. Now, did little Aboud from down the street, whose dad is a butcher, get mummified? No, it was for the wealthy. It was for the nobles, and most of the time for the kings. Not everybody's getting mummified, but at least here, 3600 or so is the beginnings of it. Only 100 years later, about 3500, Sumer, back over to them, Sumer will start making wheeled carts. They had wheels, but that was mostly the potter's wheel, remember? And now they're starting to think, wait a second, we put this sideways, put a little bar, they hadn't called it an axle yet, put a little, hold it, and then maybe we can even put something on there and ride on top of that. The wheel. That's only about 3500 BC. Seems kind of late, doesn't it? Well, around this time, when they're just figuring out the wheel and how to use it as a transportation device, they're also building what's called the White Temple ziggurat. A ziggurat is a a tall building that is built with kind of like concentric circles going up. That the first base, I don't know, we'll say the first base is 100 meters across, and then the next level is, say, 90 meters across. And then the next one is, and so that way they could kind of, and they would usually, a lot of times, build them kind of in like a upward ascending spiral so that people could start at the bottom without any escalators or elevators and simply follow this all the way to the top. That is what the Tower of Babel probably was. I'm not saying that it was this particular one that we found, but the Tower of Babel must have been modified on, or a modification of that idea. The funny thing is that these folks thought that if we build this thing tall enough, we can reach God. Remember, that's what they thought. Well, here's what we know about their cosmology, we'll call it. Their view of the earth. They thought that the earth was like a flat table, and there were like pilings at the four corners that kind of kept it even. But underneath is the water, the primordial water, they would call it. And at each of the four corners of this flat earth, and believe it or not, they're apparently still around, this flat earth, at each of these four corners, there were the mountains, the great mountains, and they believed that a dome rested on top of those mountains, and that actually if you could climb up high enough, you could knock on the ceiling. And on the other side of that, many of them believed, is where God was. The stars and the planets were simply lamps that were hung up there. And so they thought, let's build this thing high enough and we can get up and be where God is. That's what the Genesis story tells us. That was their view of the world, that if we could get up there and crack through that vault up there, we can get up there and hang out with God. Didn't work, obviously. So that's where the beginnings of those kind of structures. So before there were pyramids, there were these ziggurats. But we also have bronze, not only tools being developed, but weapons also. In 3400 BC is one of the most remarkable of the developments. If we look at map number 11 there, Pastor, and that's the development of what we call now the Indo-European language. All of that you see there, the brown, the red, the green, the blue, the yellow, the purple down there, the dark navy blue, all of that represents the Indo-European language family. Where does it start off? Starts off somewhere, it seems to be in what's called the Caucasus region. If you'll look between, if you can identify what the Black Sea is and the Caspian Sea, right in the middle there. That green section through there between those two seas is the Caucasus region. Seems to be that this is where the language develops. As it moves to the east, it becomes more like a Russian Serbian kind of language. As it moves to the west, you'll see the Germanic languages develop and the Romance languages develop. Albanian will actually be its own language subset. Greek will also be a part of that. But then you go down and you look to the dark blue and you'll see Persia is the first country that you see there. So that even though we think of the Persians, present day Iran, we think of the Iranians as being Arabic, they will quickly tell you they are not Arabs. They are Persians. As Persians, they are actually the descendants from the Aryans. And that will go on through Afghanistan, into the Indus River Valley, and into India. So that the language of India that was so famous in classical India, Sanskrit, is actually an Indo-European language. It's part of the same family as French and German and English and Russian. This will be the dominant language for Europe and Asia. Chinese will be a whole other ballgame. So that development is something pretty extraordinary, and it spread quickly in Africa and in Arabia and in the Levant that we talked about. It's still that Afro-Asiatic family of languages that'll become Semitic languages and others like that. Well, around this same time, Egypt is in the period of the divided kingdom. There is a kingdom in the north and a kingdom in the south. Now, ironically, the kingdom in the south, perfect, is called Upper Egypt. The kingdom in the north is Lower Egypt. You know why? Because, I shall tell you, because the Nile River is one of those strange rivers that flows from the south to the north. It originates way down in what is today called Lake Victoria, and eventually winds its way north until it spills out into the Mediterranean Sea. So the upper Nile River is where the Egyptian kingdom, known as the Upper Kingdom, was located. And you move farther north, that is to say, down the Nile, it becomes Lower Egypt. Pretty cool. But anyway, around this time, you have the Bronze Age really beginning in earnest. Even though they've been using bronze before, now it's not only bronze for decoration, it's not for imagery, it's weapons, it's tools, it's armor, it's spearheads and arrowheads, as a matter of fact. And also, by this time, full-blown Sumerian cuneiform writing system and Egyptian hieroglyphics are now in place. 3200 BC, and we finally have a systematized writing system. In other parts of the world, well, okay, while we're there with that one, stay there. That's the cuneiform that we're talking about. This is actually the first stone from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we'll talk about Gilgamesh in a minute, but you can see those triangular shapes at the top is where the top of the reed was first impressed, and then the stem of the reed is drawn down to make that impression. So all of those shapes are created into a sound system, and yeah, this is what we would call page one. It was because of this stone that I had to learn cuneiform. I had to learn Akkadian because even though it was going to help me in my biblical studies, my professor told me, when I found out that Gilgamesh, probably my favorite tale of the ancient world, was written in that original language, yeah, I gotta read it for myself. So it's fascinating. Now, around this same time, over in Ireland, the new Grange is built. It was this large structure that was used as basically a farmer's market. They have found the remains of all kinds of grains in different places, so that they actually were trading in different stalls in this new Grange there in Ireland. Same time, in Greece, an early Greek culture begins to develop. Same time, 3200 is an important year or century. Same time, the Norte Chico civilization begins in Peru. Same time, you have the beginnings of early Elamite civilization in Iran starting to grow. Now, if we can go back to to map 12, then in the first dynasty of Egypt now develops, because in the first dynasty, the Egyptian king named Narmer had decided, pardon me, that Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt needed to be united. In our old history books, way back when we were in school, we were told that Egypt was united under the king named Menes, M-E-N-E-S. What we now know is that Menes was a title that was given to him, and his actual name was Narmer. So in 3150 BC, Narmer becomes the first king of unified Egypt, who actually united the country kind of peacefully and founds the first dynasty. Around this same time, over in Scotland, they're building this great structure called Skara Brae. The next 100 years, 3000 BC, the Egyptians have developed a lunar calendar. 3000 BC, and they have and it's a pretty good calendar. Now, lunar calendars are not considered quite as precise as our solar calendars, but you know what? The Jews and the Arabs have been, the Muslims, I should say, have been following their own calendars, which are lunar, for thousands of years. But the Egyptians have created what may be the first. The same year, 3000. Now remember, we've got this structure built up in Turkey that we had talked about way back, 11,000 BC. Then we have the beginnings of the beginnings of settlements in Damascus and other places. And now in 3000 BC, same time the Egyptians had developed a calendar, after Skara Brae in Scotland, after the New Grange in Ireland, Stonehenge begins to be built. We've always thought of Stonehenge as being maybe the oldest structure in the world, or if not in the world, certainly in the British Isles. No, it's really not close. And in fact, the structure that begins isn't the stones that we now see. It actually began with 56 wooden posts. But it is a remarkable thing because it certainly accurately predicts the summer and winter solstice, and at least they've shown that it marks that. What was it built for? Everybody has a different opinion on that, and we won't get into that now. But it at that same time as Stonehenge is beginning in its wooden form, the Egyptians are starting to use papyrus. What were they using before? Stones, wet stone tablets. Even before they were using like sheepskin that we call vellum, even before that, it was stones. And then papyrus comes next. But papyrus is excruciatingly long to prepare and to create, because what they do is they take reeds from the Nile and they crush them and overlap them. So I should have gotten a picture of papyrus, but anyway, I'll show you that next time. If you look at it, you can see the overlaps where these flattened reeds have been overlapping each other and pressed down. And so there's a thick part. You got one, Pastor Elizabeth? Oh, wow. Nice. All right. Okay, so we have papyrus now in full blown. Now, in 2800 BC, yeah, we're excruciatingly getting close to where something is beginning to happen according to the storyline that we're wanting to follow. But here's what's happening elsewhere. In 2800 BC, the Khatiji phase of the Indus River Valley in India, or India and today's Pakistan, is beginning. And over in Crete, the Minoan civilization, by 2700, the palace city of Knossos has inhabitants of 80,000 people. That's unbelievable. 80,000 people who are on this island nation. Well, during that same time, and that goes back to number 13, Pastor Elizabeth, just because I'm going to show it again. This is when the Epic of Gilgamesh is written. It is the oldest, or I should say, the first written story that we have. We have calendars, we have other things, but as far as a story being passed down, this is the first one. And it starts off I just love it. The first line is, he had seen everything. Well, it's talking about Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh had been a king in the pre-Kish dynasty of um Sumer, and he had been the king of Uruk, and it talks about in the beginning about, look at the walls, how thick they are. Look at the temple to Apsu. Look at all these things that are there. Look at the the mighty battlements. Look at the river, how it runs through. Look at it, and it describes this city, and then it goes into the story proper. So what this actually is kind of a this is the thing about ancient literature, is they didn't want surprises. They didn't want to figure out the story at the end of the story. What they wanted is, give me a hint as to how this is going to turn out, because it was like they couldn't stand the suspense. Sherlock Holmes would have been a disastrous failure for the ancient cultures, because they don't want to wait until the last minute and go, it was the butler. They want to know all along, got to be the butler, got to be him. So even the Gospels are written like that, because Jesus will be telling things that are, you know what, I'm not always going to be here, or you know what, tear this temple down, and in 3 days. There's always something pointing ahead to what's going to happen. Well, in Gilgamesh, this is not only the beginning of the story as it's written, it is actually the end of the story. Because when you read about Gilgamesh, the king who was so prideful, who was really a lousy human being, he was arrogant and proud. He was willful. He would take what he wanted. He was a terrible king. And so he had to learn humility. And he did. He became friends with somebody, close friends. And the friend winds up dying in a great battle that they have against this mythical creature. And Gilgamesh wants to make these travels, and he meets a man named Utnapishti. And Utnapishti is telling him the story about the great disaster. Now, what was the great disaster? Again, we're talking about 2700 BC. Utnapishti tells Gilgamesh, well, here's what happens. The human race had become terrible, awful. And so the gods decided to destroy the human race. But they gave me enough time to build a boat. And so I and my sons built a boat and took aboard 2 of every kind of animal. I've heard this story before. And he says that when it had rained for all this time, and as the boat floated on the waters, that eventually it came to rest on a mountain. And he says that first I let go a dove, and it went, and finding no place to land, came back. Then I released a raven. Then I released the dove again, and this dove came back with, okay, this is all sounding pretty familiar to all of us. So this is a story of the flood of the. Now they call him Utnapishti. You know what Genesis calls him. Is it? Of course, a lot of people want to go, oh well, the book of Genesis was simply copying the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have a better suggestion. How about they were telling the same story, and just because of their different languages, they named their heroes different. Anyway. Gilgamesh goes through all that, meets Utnapishti, winds up going home, and having seen everything, then he set about rebuilding the city. And instead of him taking everything to himself, he began to give it to the people, so that the people could have these great shrine sites, could have these great parks and fountains, could have these great walls to defend them. So he turned outward from himself toward the people. And so it's just the most fascinating story. And I love the Iliad and the Odyssey. I love all the ancient epics. But yeah, it's Gilgamesh is the one that gets it. And it's the first of the written stories like that. Well, around the same time, 2700 we're talking about, the Old Kingdom begins in Egypt. There will be the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, kind of like everywhere else. But around the same time, we start having not only Gilgamesh has been written, but 100 years later, we have Sumerian texts from a place called Abu Salabik, which includes hymns. One is called the Instructions of Shuruppak, and it's basically like a book of Proverbs. And at the same time, we have written, it's called the Kesh Temple Hymn. It is a chant, basically. It's a hymn. It's like a psalm. All this 2600 BC. So in Palestine, what's happening? In Canaan, where are the Hebrews? And they're not there. Not yet. Won't be for a while yet. Back to our story. So now around 2600 BC, the same time, the developed Harappan phase of the Indus River Valley civilization has begun. Over in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, we have the beginnings of the Mayan culture, 2600 BC. The Mayans didn't just start 10 years before Columbus got there. They were there for a long time. They are as old as most other civilizations. In 2500 BC, King Khufu decides to create a great tomb for himself. Becomes known as the Great Pyramid of Giza. His son, and then his son after him, will build two more, and those three become known as the Pyramids of Giza. There will be other pyramids, but they will be shorter, for sure, or short meaning, not as big as the three great ones there. But we also know that around this time that the Egyptians have sent trade delegations and explorers to the farthest tip of Africa. The Egyptians call it the land of Punt. They discovered that there were cultures thriving down there, and there was trade worth having down there. And they also found out there was the coastland, there was water, giving the idea that, you know what, you can sail around this stuff. And so it won't necessarily be the Egyptians, but the Egyptians will certainly get word out to the other sailing cultures that, you know what, you can get almost anywhere by water. So the Egyptians are now proving to be great long-distance traders and explorers. And that's around the same time that the mammoth goes extinct. Wow. I thought the mammoth was gone a long time before that. Nope. The mammoth was still to be found in certain regions and would actually continue to exist on a certain island in the, what's it called? The Sea of Java, would actually live there for another few centuries, surprisingly. Well, in 2300, the Akkadian Empire is founded. Now, if you remember back on that map, farther back up there, let me see if I remember which one that was. It was like number 9. Yeah, map number 9, I think. That if you'll, the Akkadian civilization is one that has developed with, pardon me, Babylon. Oh, well, actually, that's not the one. Oh, well, sorry about that. Okay, if I said number 9, then it should probably be number 7 then. Yeah, that's the one. Okay. So you'll see down there where Eridu, Ur, and Uruk are located in the ancient land of Sumer. But then just to the north is the Akkadians. And the Akkadians will build their capital at Akkad. And it has the question mark behind Akkad, if you can see that, the city there, when actually Akkad and Babylon are are very close neighbors, closer than what the map seems to indicate. So that actually the capital that it develops at Akkad will eventually move over to Babylon. So that's the next development along the Fertile Crescent. It'll start down there in Sumer, go up to Akkad, and eventually work its way around that whole crescent there. Now, that's in about 2300. Over in the Americas, in 2250, is the first. They call it the staff god, and it's the oldest image of a god, a deity, found in the Americas. It's about 2250. Then a strange things happens in the period from 2200 to 2100, and they call it the 4.2 kiloyear event. It was an incredible drought that probably caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and perhaps of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. That same time, 2200, Stonehenge is finally complete. Taking them a good long time to do that. And then we see the beginnings of the Middle Kingdom. But around the year 2000 is the beginnings of the oral tradition of Job. When we look really carefully at Job, what we now have as the book of Job is actually a editing together of 4 different phases of Job. They were never independent of each other, but there was different developments of 4 storylines. For example, the first composed is actually Job being, and we don't know why, if we were to look at it just at just that part of the story, that Job is sick, his children have died, his crops have failed, his livestock are dead. He doesn't know why, and his so-called friends show up to him and say, wow, you really offended God somehow. And Job goes, I didn't do anything. I'm a good guy. Nope, you must have done something. Why? Because they believed that the only reason that misfortune would befall somebody is because they had offended God somehow. Well, that doesn't wind up being a very satisfying story, because where it ends is Job not being able to find any answers. That was completely unsatisfying to them, and so they wound up wanting to find out, well, why? Why did this happen this way? So they created the first part. Then they wrote in the story of Satan going to see God and saying, reporting in, and God saying, well, do something to Job. Well, now at least we know what happened to Job and why it happened. Well, we don't really know why. It doesn't really seem too much of an answer as to why, except God saying, Job won't cave in on me. Job ain't going to throw me under the bus. Don't care what you do. Again, but the story doesn't quite end right for them. So they wind up then adding a 4th friend, Elihu. And Elihu is just a little jerk. And this kid doesn't know anything, and he comes around he's trying to school the 3 elders, Bildad, Zophar, and the other one, and trying to school Job. Let me tell you what the real thing is. Well, okay. Still, they wound up creating a 4th one, the last chapter. And in the last chapter, God says, okay, enough is enough. Now, here's one thing that and I'm spending way too much time on this, but I start talking about Job and I can't quit, is that you have Elihu saying all this nonsense, and then comes God's response. And God is angry. But when you read it very carefully, God is angry at Elihu. And so Job, being the loving person he is, steps in and takes the fire. he takes the anger of God, he takes the rebuke of God, because he's trying to, this is the kind of friend he is, while his 3+1 are not that great of friends, really. So in the end, if you look carefully, Job will hear from God, and God will then talk to the three friends. Funny thing is, he doesn't mention Elihu. He mentions the other three, and he tells them, look, you guys better ask Job for forgiveness. If Job forgives you, then I will. And it's all about, and that is the beginning of the Hebrew festival of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. On what's called Erev Yom Kippur, that is the evening of the Day of Atonement, on the day before the Day of Atonement, you have to ask others for forgiveness before you ever ask God for forgiveness. That is still in the Jewish calendar. You ask others for forgiveness, then God will forgive you. Otherwise, don't go. But doesn't Jesus say the same thing? If, before you go and make your sacrifice in the temple, you need to clear things up with everybody else. So in the end, God restores everything to Job, but that has taken hundreds of years for it to develop into the story we now have. What we have beginning about the year 2000 is the beginning of the part of the suffering of Job, and not really knowing what the purpose is. In 1900, there will be it's called the Erlitou culture in China developing. And then finally, we begin to see alphabetic writing starting to emerge, not just creating pictograms or sounds like the Egyptians hieroglyphics were doing, but now, if we'll look at map number 15, Pastor, you'll see that this is the time that the Enuma Elish is written in Akkadian. And the Enuma Elish, I must have numbered it wrong, because maybe the one before? There it is. This is the Enuma Elish, which was the creation epic, where the Akkadians describe what happened. But also what we have is that this is the beginning of the first song, which is a hymn, and it includes musical notation. Now, I remember studying in my music history class way back in the day that the first musical notation was simple chord structure, or not chords, but modes, like in the Greeks. Or along came a guy named Guido, not making this up, a guy named Guido, who was a choir director in Italy, and he would actually use his hand. The system was called Guido's hand, where he would touch certain parts of his hand to designate certain tones that the choir was supposed to. So this is how he's leading the choir, and it's got to be people with good eyesight, or just a few of them standing really close. But this that we're seeing here is actually containing musical notations for this hymn. And this, we're talking about 1800 BC. 1800 BC. Finally, a guy we recognize. In 1800 BC, Abraham leaves the city of Ur, there you go, way down there, and he begins his trek up the Euphrates River, and he winds up going up to a place called Haran. Brief story there. We know that when Abraham gets down to Egypt, remember the story that it says Abraham talks to the king, and the king wants Abraham's wife, and Abraham says, oh, well, she's my sister. And we always read that story and we think, wow, you should be claiming your wife like that. What are you doing? And so then Pharaoh wants to take her, and then he finds out that this is really Abraham's wife, Sarah. or Sarai, as she was called at the time. And he was like, "What are you doing? You trying to get me in trouble? This is your wife, for crying out loud." Well, here's a little back to that story, a little backdrop to that story, is that when Abraham made it up to Haran and lived there for some little while, he took on the customs of Haran. And in Haran, the tradition was when you get married, you don't just have a ceremony where you become husband and wife. They actually have an adoption ceremony where she becomes your sister. So the sense behind that is you might leave your wife, but you can never leave your sister. So it was a way of, no matter how some of us may have tried, that there's just no way to abandon once you have been joined like this. So as far as Abraham is now concerned, to say she's my sister is to tell the whole story, but the king of Egypt doesn't get it. So it wasn't Abraham being a coward or not caring about Sarah or trying to save his own skin. It was simply cultures had changed. He had moved from one place to the next, and there's a new sheriff in town. Well, so now that's 1800 when he leaves from Ur, heads for Haran, and eventually will make it to the land of Canaan. Only about 20 years after that, Hammurabi will be the king in Babylon. And that's when we have the famous Code of Hammurabi. The code was actually written on they call it a stele. It was actually what do you call it? A boundary post. And it was like 7 feet tall, and all these laws were written all around this kind of a 8-sided post. The point is, when you come into the land, don't say you're ignorant of the law, because before you come in, here's the laws. Stop and read the laws. For a long time, we were told that Hammurabi's code was the oldest law in the ancient world. It's not by any means the oldest. In fact, there are 10 codes that predate that. So not the oldest, but certainly the most famous of the bunch. In 1700, the Indus River Valley civilization has come to an end. Why? Because I think I need to go to the next map, don't I? Yeah, I think I have a map for that. Anyway, yep, go to the next one. There it is. The Aryan, sometimes called the Aryan migration, sometimes it's called the Aryan invasion. And when we say the word Aryan, yep, we're talking about the same Aryan culture or race that became so infamous during the Third Reich in Germany. These Aryans carry the Indo-European language, and they cross across Iran. They've created a culture there in Iran. The Persians, Farsi is actually an Indo-European language, but then the Aryans move on down into the south. Now, in India, the culture that had existed there was known as the Dravidians. They are now kind of driven to the south, and these fairer skinned Aryans take over. They create the language of Sanskrit, which is what the language of the Hindu religious texts and even early Buddhism will be written in Sanskrit. And during this time is when they have made their way into India and have set up a dominance in there. Well, shortly after that, remember those horse people I had told you about up in what is present day Kazakhstan? These people known as the Hyksos begin driving down through the south. They have knocked off the primitive Hittite culture that was there. They drive through Canaan and all the way into Egypt. They eventually wind up conquering Egypt. In 1650, these foreigners have conquered Egypt. It is during this time that Joseph winds up going into Egypt. And why does he meet such success there? Because there were now non-Egyptian rulers. And so these non-Egyptian rulers, these Hyksos, have created a culture that welcomes the outsider. Why? Because they're outsiders. So the Hyksos now are in control of Egypt. And so Joseph, who is an outsider, comes to their attention. He rises up to the place of what they would call Bazir, which was like the prime minister, second only to the Pharaoh, and brings the family to Egypt because they were escaping, of course, the famine. You remember the Genesis story. So for a couple of centuries, the Hyksos will be in control. But you remember that the scripture tells us in Genesis that there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Well, what that's talking about is that the Egyptians, the original Egyptians, had overthrown the Hyksos, had driven them out by 1500, and were now back in control. So now the Egyptians have become kind of insular again. They only want Egyptians in the government, and so the Hebrews who are there are driven into a life of slavery. Why? Because they're not Egyptians. They're foreigners, and because of being under what they would call foreign dominance, the Egyptians now kind of hate foreigners at this point. Shortly thereafter, the Minoan civilization in Crete is destroyed by the eruption of the what was it called? The Santorini Island. There was a volcano there. The eruption and earthquake that followed just destroyed them. So most of those will wind up going up into Greece, and it will be known as Mycenaean Greece. The city of Mycenae was one of the first great Greek cities there. And when you read stories like the Iliad, King Agamemnon is the king of Mycenae. There at Mycenae is one of the first recognizable forms of true architecture, it's called, and it was at a place called the Lion's Gate. And it was simply post and lintel architecture. You know what that is. You look at your doors, that's all post and lintel. You have the two posts and then a lintel piece across it. Believe it or not, that started way back here about 1600 BC. Seems like should have been earlier than that, but most of those others were a lot of arches and rounded stuff. Post and lintel, a late development. Around the same time, over in China, the Shang dynasty develops, and by this time, by the Shang dynasty, we have a fully developed Chinese writing system. I mean, they've got, by this time, a vocabulary of something like I think it's 60,000 words or something like that, which is pretty incredible. The Hittites discover iron around this same time, and that is going to tip the balance of power. Around 1550, and I'm going to try to run through this because we are way over, the new kingdom in Egypt develops. In this dynasty called the 18th dynasty, you have Ahmose the First, and then his wife or daughter takes over. Her name is Hatshepsut, the only female pharaoh that we know of. Now, you think about Cleopatra, she wasn't a pharaoh. She was the queen of Egypt. That was a whole different ballgame. But Hatshepsut was a builder, a trader, a diplomat, brilliant. But when she dies, she is almost erased from Egyptian architecture, buildings, pardon me, because her son, Thutmose III, doesn't want to remember her at all. Doesn't want her to be known. In fact, he winds up taking a lot of credit for what she had done. It wasn't until they discovered certain tombs that they found records about Hatshepsut, and that was in the 20th century. So she was lost for history, one of the great rulers ever of Egypt. But yeah, the good old boys club Didn't quite like it. Also, during that same time, you have Amenhotep IV, who will wind up changing his name to Akhenaten, which means Aten is one. It is the beginning of monotheism in Egypt. Before Moses ever got there, before any of that, Akhenaten had decided that there was truly one God. It caused such a horrible reaction to the priests of the various cults in Egypt that Akhenaten, when he died, it was almost the same fate that befell Hatshepsut. They wanted to release or erase everything. And his brat kid, Tutankhamun, King Tut, remember him? Born in Arizona, moved to Babylonia. Anyway, sorry, Steve Martin song. King Tut then was only a child, probably 11 when he became king, and he was manipulated by a general in the Egyptian army named Haramhab, who just was the power behind the throne. Anyway, around this same time, 1500, the Hindus are writing their oldest text called the Rig Veda. It is the first of the Hindu sacred writings. The Rig Veda will become part of this massive literature of the ancient Hindus. Around this same time, the Olmecs are developing, but also in 1240 BC is when finally, the Exodus takes place. When the people move out, it is probably during the reign of Ramses II, who was a great builder. In fact, he's known as the great builder of ancient Egypt. And the joke was always in our history class that if the professor ever said, who built this temple, just answer Ramses II, because you're probably right. He built everything. The temple at Abu Simbel, he built that. All of these other great things, yep, that was him. But it was during this time that Moses led the people out. Of course, we know about them wandering around for a good long time. And in around this time also, actually a little bit later, about 1193, is the Greeks destroy the city of Troy. Also around this time, iron now begins to be found by other nations, and warfare takes on a whole other aspect. Bronze was great for spears and for all like that, not so good for swords, but now when you have iron, all of a sudden the development of a sword comes into it, or a battle axe, and close combat now becomes terrifying. Not too long after, the Zhou dynasty in China overthrows the Shang dynasty. And at the same time, over in a place called Canaan, Samuel, a prophet, anoints a king named Saul, who unites the 12 tribes into one united kingdom. Yeah, the United Monarchy, it was called. 40 years after that, King David will become the second king, and 30 years after that, Solomon will become the third. Here we are in 970 BC, and King Solomon is the king. By 890, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey being composed. And it won't be for another 50 years after that that the beginnings of the Pentateuch are written. By 850, 840 BC, the first writings that will become what we call the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, will start taking shape. It took a long, long time to get here. The writings of the Old Testament attest to a specific time and a specific beginning, but so much had gone on in other places before, and we're continuing to go on. So one of the thing I really wanted to show through all this, and I did it in excruciating detail, was to show that there was a lot going on in the world before the Hebrews started writing. In fact, the Hebrew language doesn't even start taking shape until about 100 years before that. Before that, believe it or not, they were actually using pictograms also, not like the Hebrew you see today. For example, the first letter resembled an ox head, and that letter was called Aleph. And the word Aleph, think about an ox, the word Aleph means strong. So this pictogram of an ox's head means strong. Now, if you take the second letter, which is Beth, it looks like an aerial view or a floor plan of a tent, of a Hebrew tent. And so it means house, all right? Beth means house. That's why you have Bethlehem, the house of bread, or Bethel, the house of God. All those things that are Beth, it all means house. So when you take the first letter, Aleph, strong, second letter, Beth, house, Ab, as it's called, the strong man of the house, is the word used for father. And if you know those stories about the Hebrew language, even if you don't know what this particular word means, you can look at the letters in their ancient form and kind of figure out, must be this. It's a fascinating thing. Languages are just terrific. And those pictorial languages like that were just a wonder to look at. They gave personalities to each of those letters too. The letter Lamed is kind of a bent letter, and they referred to Lamed as the scholar, like a scholar bent over reading at a desk or writing at a desk. But the language that they have now is actually the adopted alphabet from the Aramaic language. So it doesn't even look like it did in the very beginning. Still, they have found tablets that contain those letters on them. That's how we know what it looked like back then. 850, the first writings of the Torah. And now what's going to take place is that we're in the period of the monarchy, and after Solomon, then the monarchy is going to divide again. His son is going to lose control of the 10 tribes from the north, and so it'll be divided into 2 kingdoms, north and south. And that's really when the writing gets started. That's when we really get into the stories of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and but things in other parts of the world are still going on. So thank you for your patience. Promise next time won't be this long. Maybe.
I was just thinking that, Travis, thank you. I mean, your passion for all of this comes through shining in wonderful glory. And one of the things I might recap the beginning of this recording with that. There was a lot going on in the world before the Hebrews started writing things down.
Good summation. Yeah.
And one thing that, and so if you need to go, feel free to go. But I wanted to share one thing that I had learned earlier today when I was in a session hanging out with some Moravian pastors. And we've been talking about the history of what's been happening around the world, and you're tying it to what's happening in history and how does that get reflected in writing. And you mentioned about Genesis, they're describing the world as they experienced it and understood in their culture. And one thing that was mentioned today was that the reminder that when the first creation story in Genesis is written, the people writing that are in post-exilic situation, which we'll touch on a little bit next, right? So these people who experience not being human, not being seen as fully human, write this story that reflects their cosmology of the world, and they are human. Yeah. So it just pairing that what's happening around the world with also what's historically within the Bible as well, interpreting scripture that way. So this is just super rich. And I'm going to pause the recording here, and then we have time if people want to ask more questions. But again, Travis, can you recap again where we're going next, where we're sort of headed for the next session in 2 weeks, which
Well,
is
next time in 2 weeks, we will talk about what is going on in the divided kingdom, divided monarchy, in the kingdoms of North and South. But all of a sudden now Israel becomes a player with the kingdom of Babylon, with the kingdom of Egypt, with the Phoenicians. Remember that, and I deliberately mentioned the city of Byblos because Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre will be known as the Phoenician kingdoms. That all of a sudden now Israel is starting to be a crossroads between Egypt and Babylon and the ancient kingdom of Sumer. And so the influences on each other is going to be pretty remarkable. And it's not always going to be a happy relationship between all of them. Basically, Israel can't get along with each other. So how are they going to get along with everybody else? While at other times, the Greeks are all, beginning to prepare at this time. And when we start getting into the period of the exile, the Greek culture is in full bloom by this time. By the time we get to the end of the prophets, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle have come and gone. Alexander the Great will come marching right through downtown Jerusalem and then move on to Egypt and to Persia. So all these kingdoms in the Near East that we talked about are going to be major players in the biblical story, if not in the narrative itself, at least in the influence on the stories that are being told.
all right. We look forward to hearing more next time. Thanks.
Me too.